We're outside. Yeah, boy, finally. The little bird is out of his nest. Let me just sit down. Всем привет, my name is Elvin. Welcome back to yet another video. So glad to see all of you. Today we're talking about Sia. And no, not the artist. We're talking about shutter, ISO and aperture, which is considered the three pillars of photography. Now you might be wondering, why is it so? Well, let's consider shutter as the sand. It's cool and all, I mean the texture is really nice, but it's just sand. I mean, you get sand in Portugal, you get sand in the Sahara, and most probably you have sand in your backyard or something. But add a little bit of sea or water to it, and we got ourselves a beach. And that we'll call the aperture. But still, it's missing just one tiny element, and that is the sun. So we'll call that the ISO. Put these all three together, and we got ourselves a beautiful sunrise at the beach here in Portugal. Oh yeah, look at that, beautiful. Now I could straight up tell you exactly what each one of them means, which is what I learned throughout this week, but then again, where's the fun in that? So I have a better idea. I'm gonna go most probably up to the sea, and I'll make a picture with just full auto settings on my camera, just to get like a baseline of some settings. Then I'll go to manual mode, put the same settings, and then change the aperture, ISO and shutter just to get a series of pictures. Then we go home, load it up on our computer, and then we do a little analysis with the basics just to get a better understanding with examples. I think that's going to be better as a way to learn. So let's try to pull this off. Oh, and by the way, sorry if the audio is bad, because that sea is very loud, way louder than I thought it would be. That was harder than I thought. I need to rethink my strategy. Gotta make a photo of something else. The sea is just way too unexpected. New strategy. Camera, tripod, timer, and I'm gonna just use my skateboard and I'm just gonna launch it from just over there. And let's see if we can capture something.
And we're back at our bedroom studio. I must admit, speaking to a camera in front of people, even if it was like 7 in the morning, was so nerve-wracking. But anyways, I managed to do it, so that's a win for today. So let us look at the shutter. Now a shutter is like a door, which is located right in front of the sensor. Whenever we press the shoot button, it basically flips up, allowing light to come in contact with the sensor before closing back down. Now, you know it's working because whenever you press the shoot button, it does the sound. Now, the speed at which this shutter opens and closes can be changed by ourselves through the camera settings, and the different speeds affect images differently. Now here are a couple of images that I made earlier this morning using different shutter speeds while keeping all the other settings the same. Don't worry, I'll zoom in through all of them as we go through it. Now the first image we'll look at is actually the middle one using the auto settings, just to have some values that we can play around with. Now in this case, the shutter is 1/60 or a 60th of a second. And the first thing that catches my eye is that the skateboard itself is blurry. It has this motion blur going on, so we can see that the skateboard was moving. Now for the next image, I slowed down the shutter twice to 1/30 or a 30th of a second. And you can see that the image is significantly brighter and you have way more motion blur. Now I did it once more, slowing it down to 1/15th of a second, and it's even brighter and has even more motion blur. So the assumption we can make is that the slower the shutter speed is, the brighter the images become and the more action is captured by the camera, which translates into more and more motion blur. And as a bonus image, I actually slowed the shutter to 1/8 of a second, which translates into a very bright image, and also the only thing you can see from a skateboard is just a trail. Which now I understand how they make those images where you have those long trail of light from passing cars. Now going back to our original image, I went the opposite direction, doubling the shutter speed to 1/125. And we see a darker image and it seems like less motion blur. Then I took it one step further, changing it to 1/320, and this gave us a much darker image. Next, I doubled it once more to 1/640, and we get ourselves such a dark image we practically don't see the skateboard anymore. But the question is, What about the motion blur? And this is where my beach analogy starts taking shape. Now, given that my shutter speed needs to stay the same, I need to use the other two settings to hopefully compensate the brightness. Now, unfortunately, my aperture is as wide as it can get, so I have only ISO left. So I increase my ISO to 1600 and now we can see the image. And interestingly enough, the skateboard has no motion blur. So the assumption we can make is that a faster shutter speed gives us less light, so darker images, but clearer and sharper images. Now let us look at ISO. ISO, unlike shutter or aperture, is not a physical item inside a camera. It's a purely digital setting and it dictates how sensitive the sensor is to light. We can call it like fake light basically. Now when you change your ISO by 1, you're effectively doubling the sensitivity of the sensor. This is why the settings of the ISO are always in the increments of 2s, so 100, 200, 400, 800. Now, ISO is pretty straightforward. The higher the number, the brighter the image is, the lower the number, the darker it is. Now it is important to remember that the ISO is fake light. So in very low light conditions, if you crank up your ISO way too high, it's going to introduce a lot of noise to your image. Now I heard that more expensive cameras perform better with higher ISO in low conditions with less noise. However, we need to use ISO like salt. You don't want too much salt in your food or it's going to be too salty, but you don't want too little. You want just enough to make your food taste much better. Now let's talk about aperture. Aperture is basically a disc with blades fitted inside a camera lens, which allows us to control the diameter of the ring through which light passes through. Now, a wide aperture means more light comes in, a smaller aperture means a small light comes in. Now, there's a small catch. In the camera settings, a higher aperture number is actually a smaller aperture size, which means less light. And a smaller number means a higher aperture size, which means more light. Here are a couple of images that I made using different aperture numbers or f-stops. The first image will actually borrow from when we're covering ISO. Here our aperture is at 4, which is the widest that my camera lens can go. Double it to 8 and our image becomes darker. Double it once more to 16 and it's even more darker. Now the same goes for the opposite. Unfortunately, my camera lens is limited to 4, but there are other lenses out there that can go as low as 1.4, and these ones are more preferable for low light situations and low light shooting. Now, an interesting feature associated with aperture is depth of field. This is when you have this nice blurry background behind your subject or an area that you are focusing on. And the general rule is the wider your aperture is, which means the smaller f-stop, the more blurriness you have. And the smaller the aperture is, which means the bigger the number is, the more clear and focused the background is. And this basically sums up the 3 pillars of photography. Now, I do have a couple of bonus information which will be useful for both me and you guys and worth mentioning. The first one relates to the shutter speed. As you know, slow shutter plus movement equals blurriness. And this also concerns us holding the camera and the camera shake. So to prevent camera shake and be in the no shake zone, what we need to do is to match the shutter speed with the focal length of our lens. In other words, if your lens is 30mm, then the shutter speed is 1/30 at minimum. If it's 50, it's 1/50. If it's 200, then it's 1/200. The second fact is related to the aperture, and it is known as the fast lens and the slow lens. And it basically describes the relationship between the aperture and the shutter. So when we have a fast lens, it means it's a lens that has an aperture of 2.8 or smaller, meaning it can go so wide that we can shoot photos using a fast shutter without cranking up the ISO. While in the slow lens, an aperture does not open as wide, like in my case, so I cannot shoot with a fast shutter without compensating the brightness using ISO. And on this note, that's it guys. I hope you found this information useful. Do drop a like, comment down below, also consider subscribing. All this help is greatly appreciated. And guys, I recommend you all to go outside and to do this experiment like I did. Change the settings, make a couple of random pictures and see how these settings are affecting your images. This way we can grasp this concept much easier. Thank you for watching and I see you in the next one.
Of photography. Now why is it pillars? Well, I don't remember. Jesus, this sun is so cold. Now, I could just straight up tell